Hey guys, Naz here with another tutorial. Today I'm going to be taking you through how I did these dark lines on Twilight's mane and tail. This is kind of a really specific tutorial, but it was a technique that I came up with and I thought it was really interesting. So if you need to do large lines like this on a plush, particularly relevant to life-size ponies that have those hairlines, hopefully this will help you out. So I really didn't want to have to do satin stitching on this because, for one, it would have meant I would have had to do it on my regular sewing machine, and that takes a really long time to get it to look good. And two, it just would have taken forever. Like, there's such huge lines, I don't think they would have looked that amazing if I'd done them manually. So I wanted a nice solid line that didn't require satin stitching. So the first step to making these lines is you obviously want to pattern out your hair first, mark on your pattern where you want the lines to go. I've made tutorials on how to do that, but really just stitch out something like the mane or the tail, draw on with Sharpie where you want the lines to go, unpick that, scan it in, overlay it onto your pattern pieces and draw in where you want those lines. So you're going to go and you're going to draw the outline of your pattern, and then you're going to cut up this piece and use that to draw on the back piece of the minky where you want that line to go, because this is going to be used as a guide and we're going to use this to show where we're going to lay down the lines. So just an easy first step, work out where you want your lines, mark them out, and then we're going to make sure that we can use them as a guide when we flip the minky over to the other side. The next step is about as simple as they come. We're going to set our sewing machine up with a straight stitch, and we're going to use a thread, just a regular thread, sewing thread that sort of matches or blends into the minky colour. So I'm just using black on navy blue. You're not going to see this, but don't go using some fluoro coloured thread. Try and get something that at least kind of matches. And we're going to have the wrong side of the minky facing up, and all we're going to do is we're going to do a straight stitch over all those hairlines. So as I told you where to mark them earlier, we're just going to go and stitch over every single line where we want those final thick lines to be. So it's a little bit time consuming, but really you're just using that Sharpie mark as a guide and going ahead and doing all those straight stitches every single place that you want to have those lines. And then once we flip this over, that is going to show us exactly where we need to place the lines so that when we sew our pattern, they're all in the right spot. So one thing that you definitely need for this tutorial, and you can get it from any sewing store, is basting tape. So this is essentially just a little double-sided tape that's used for dressmaking. So you'll have one side that's sticky and the other side is sort of like a sticker backing, and then you can peel off the backing once you've stuck the initial side down. So you're also going to need some bias tape. You can either make your own or you can buy it. I personally went and bought it because making bias tape is a real pain. It's really time consuming, and it's just easier just to buy the really cheap bias binding, bias edging. You can get it at any sort of sewing store. I'm personally using a cotton type here just because that's the only one I could find in that extremely dark navy, but you could potentially use a prettier one, sort of like a ribbon finish one, a satiny kind one. But you can see here that I'm just picking the wrong side of the bias because this is going to be the side that's stuck down, and I'm just pressing on that double-sided tape. Now once I've done that, I'm going to sort of lay it and work out exactly what length of bias I'm going to need to fit along this line, and I'm just going to trim that off the long piece of bias that I've already prepped with tape. I used about 2 rolls of bias, and then I used 3 rolls of tape. The tape that I bought was in quite a small roll, so just make sure that you have enough because you are doing very, very long lines. You can get bias binding in all sorts of widths. I found that to get the exact width that I wanted, I had to fold mine in half. So just keep that in mind. If you can't find one that's thin enough, you can always fold it in half and make it a little bit smaller. So I've peeled away the wrong side of that double-sided tape, or the sticker side, so I've revealed the glue, and I'm just pressing this down on top of that straight stitch that we've already put in there. And so we're using that as a guide, and we're just gently laying that down, pushing the glue into the minky, trying to smooth it out as much as we can, trimming off any excess. One thing I would recommend, and that I didn't do here, is I would leave a little bit extra of your bias hanging off each end, because I found when I started to sew it, it liked to shift a little bit, and in some cases I found that I didn't have enough. It sort of pulled in towards the minky piece, so I just leave a little bit extra, and it'll also give you something to pull behind your sewing machine if your sewing machine gets a bit finicky stitching through that glue. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to top stitch down our bias. So I'm just using a regular straight stitch. I've loaded up some thread that matches the bias, so I want to make this stitch as invisible as possible, unless you want to do it for some decorative reason. But yeah, I just used a dark navy thread with this one here. And you can see that I'm using an open-toed foot. I would definitely recommend doing this with either an open-toed foot or a see-through foot, because if you can't see where you're stitching when you're doing this top stitching, it's going to be nearly impossible to get a really clean, exact finish. You really want to do this straight stitch right near the edge of your bias, and we're going to do that on both sides. So rather than just doing one straight stitch down the middle, I felt like the edges of the bias might curl upwards if I just did that. So I'm doing a straight stitch on either side and probably coming in about 1 millimeter, so just the tiniest whiff in from the edge. You don't want to go too close to the edge because then you can sew off. It doesn't really matter if you accidentally get a couple of stitches off. I wasn't perfect the whole time I did this, but it just looks nicer if you can sort of keep it consistent going all the way down. It can be a little tricky to get started with this because your machine might fuss a little bit sort of starting so close to the edge. That's another reason why I would recommend leaving a bit longer of that bias on the edge so you have something to sort of guide it through, help pull it through a little bit if your machine is being fussy. I would also note that you really have to have the sewing machine grade double-sided tape. I ended up trying to use, I ran out of that tape, and I tried to use just normal double-sided tape that you would use for office supplies, and it really gummed up the needle. It was terrible. Like, I could only stitch a few stitches and then I would just get knots underneath the machine constantly. So you really need to get that specific double-sided tape. So under this bright light you can really see what that stitching looks like. It's just a standard straight stitch, but it's really not very noticeable once you don't have that sort of bright light highlighting the texture of all those threads. If you look from a distance and your thread matches, you should barely be able to tell the difference at all. So here I'm just going and repeating the same process. It takes a fair while because you are making a really big plush, but this takes a lot less time than doing satin stitching would and uses a lot less thread. I would say it's probably cheaper, all the thread that you would save. Bias isn't very expensive, so I really think that this is a much better alternative to doing satin stitching. Another thing that I've found, I don't know if you guys have noticed when you do satin stitching, whether by sewing machine or embroidery machine, a lot of the time when you do satin stitching on something that is going to be stuffed, you get these sort of ripple effects. The satin stitching doesn't want to stay straight, nice and flush to the edge of the fabric. It sort of contorts and bunches. I think this is because of the difference of the stretch, because the minky around it wants to stretch, but the satin stitching is so dense that it just stops the minky from stretching, and then you get that ripply bunching effect. I really haven't found a way to entirely stop that, and it's kind of a pain. I've seen like a lot of people have had to deal with it as well. But doing this, you don't get that because the minky can still stretch because you're only running a straight stitch through it. So really you're not restricting it as much as you would by doing that thick, dense satin stitching. So that's another advantage. I don't know if I could do this any smaller. I thought about trying to do it on my normal scale ponies, so sort of like 16-inch sort of size, to replace the satin stitching, but I'm really not sure if you could find tape that would be thin enough. I think you would really need to use very small, very thin ribbon to match the width of the satin stitching you would need for a pony of that proportion. But it's something I have thought about using this technique for, because it would be nice to get rid of that rippling effect on stuffed pieces. Anyway, you just clean your threads up and really that's it. I don't use any sort of stabilizer on the back. You can if you want. It'll probably give you a neater effect, or it might be a little bit easier, but I didn't really have any problem with threads bunching or any sort of unsightly look from not using the stabilizer, because you're really only doing a straight stitch as long as you're careful with your stitching and keeping it neat. But I hope you guys learned a bit from this tutorial. It was sort of a technique that came into my head one day I thought was really cool. I really like how it looks, especially from afar. They just look really seamless compared to satin stitching on large areas. But anyway, I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, send me a private message. I'll be happy to answer them, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!